Okay, so what would you say your first experience with writing is? Like, what got you into writing?
So when I was a kid, I read a lot. I was not a very good reader. I read a lot of audiobooks because I had a hard time looking at words on a page. And then I would read the same audiobooks over and over and over again because they were familiar and I knew what I was getting into. And then I read a lot of Star Wars novels. And so that sort of translated into writing a lot of Star Wars fan fiction when I was in my teenage years. But as soon as I sort of got to high school and was told I had to read all these classic novels, I had a really hard time reading classics, and so I just stopped reading and became bitter and resentful towards books in general. So I did a history degree for my undergrad. I went abroad for a couple of years and worked on a thesis, and while I was there working on the thesis, the historian I was working with told me that my papers read like novels, and I couldn't say things like Richard III paced his tower room angrily because she's like, we don't have evidence for this. And I couldn't write dialogue for Henry V, and I was like, but that's what I want to be writing. And so that was when I sort of realized that maybe I was writing history in the wrong way and in the wrong medium. So that's a little bit of how I got into writing, that's sort of the cliff notes of it. There's a lot of other meandering and then lots of rejection after that, and lots of writing things that never go anywhere. And yeah, but that's the short story of it.
How do you begin books? For example, Gentleman's Guide. What did you start with? Did you start with characters, setting, plot?
I thought you meant how do you start writing, and I was with panic, with so much anxiety, with caffeine. So a lot of my books come from historical settings that I'm interested in writing about. Or sort of more specifically, I think historical phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So with Gentleman's Guide, it came from being very interested and fascinated in this idea of the grand tour and young men taking their grand tour in the 1700s, especially because I am very much a subscriber to the idea that history changes but people don't really. Mm-hmm. And so I really like this idea of even in the 1700s, we were taking gap years and we were traveling to find ourselves, and young people were going abroad to both learn and also be hedonistic and things like that. Ulterior motives.
And, repress the system and go against it.
Yeah, I know. I recently heard someone say every generation thinks they invented teen rebellion. So, and it was happening even in the 1700s. Yeah. So most of my books come from historical settings or time periods that I'm really interested in writing about. And generally that I don't know anything about going in, because in spite of being a history major, I had a very, very narrow focus that I was working on for my thesis. Mm-hmm. And then I started writing about these time periods, and I'm I don't know anything about this. And that's where the panic comes in.
Where do you see yourself in the characters?
It's the least flattering answer I can give to this question is I am a lot like Monty in Gentleman's Guide. A lot of his emotional struggles, in spite of having a very different background and a lot of different challenges than I've had in my life, he and I have a lot of the same sort of emotional
coping almost?
Yeah, coping mechanism. I'm not an alcoholic. But in terms of feeling we're lots of feelings, I was really interested in feeling you're not good enough to help the people you love. It's a weird feeling because part of you feels you have intensely failed this person you love.
Yeah.
But also you didn't know about it, so how could, I don't know, it's a weird, complicated thing, and that was something I was definitely exploring when I wrote the book, and something I'm still kind of trying to come to terms with after many years in the future.
So maybe a slight transition, but your characters have a lot of development throughout the book. You can see a great change in Monty, and I would argue a great change in Felicity and Percy as well. When you were starting to characterize them in your mind, did you have the change in mind while you were writing the book, or when you started writing the book, or did it kind of just happen naturally?
A combination of both, I think. Percy and Felicity were definitely not as fleshed out when I first started writing. I was very focused on Monty and his journey, and I knew I wanted to write that sort of a reformed rake kind of an arc to it. Yeah. And so his journey was always in my sort of initial plan for it. Mm-hmm. Felicity and Percy grew out of being sort of vehicles for his growth, and then became sort of their own characters and and had their own growth over the course of the novel. But I think with anything in a book, as much as you the best laid plans. You can plan everything, and then it's still going to change. It's still going to be different. It's still going to things are going to surprise you, and they're going to evolve over the revision process.
Has it ever felt the characters have kind of become their own beings?
Oh, yes.
And are leading the story?
Yeah, it definitely does sometimes. it's kind of like, it's something I kind of always roll my eyes at when authors say that they're like, oh, and then this character surprised me, or they were walking off this direction and I wanted them to walk this direction.
Yeah.
And it's always something, that I'm kind of like, okay,
Yeah,
that's fake. These
Yeah.
are people you invented. But then it does happen every once in a while when you're writing.
I get that.
Like things happen that you don't expect, or I think it's more that in the process of writing, you sort of end up it's like digging, and you end up uncovering things you don't expect, and then you're like more interested sometimes in this like shiny rock you just uncovered, as opposed to like the treasure you are digging for. And so sometimes you have to veer off, and this is a terrible metaphor.
No, I love
you gotta
this
look
metaphor.
at the shiny sometimes.
You gotta become the metaphor.
Yeah, and so sometimes I will just like I will write a line sort of flippantly or offhandedly as you're just sort of drafting and just like furiously trying to get words out of your brain and onto the page, and then you sort of look back at it and like, oh, that's an interesting. And I don't know if that's like my subconscious functioning and being and dumping things. I don't know, but so yeah, every once in a while there are things that I couldn't point to like one thing and be like, this thing I totally didn't see coming. But it definitely happens more for me, I think, in terms of character than anything else.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, can readers be expecting anything more from you anytime soon? Or anything else?
Readers can't get rid of me.
I don't want to.
So I have a nonfiction book coming out in February called Bygone Badass Broads, which is a collection of short essays about 52 women who changed the world that you probably don't know about. It's based on a Twitter series I've been running for about 2 years now. And yeah, basically just highlights forgotten women from all over history, all over the world, and just talks about how they kicked ass. And if history intimidates you, it's told very much in the same way I talk, so it's very informal, and so it's a little bit, I'm very into like accessible history.
Yeah.
And so it's also illustrated by a Spanish illustrator named Petra Erickson. I think she's Spanish, she's in Barcelona. I don't remember if she's actually Spanish, but her illustrations are so pretty. So even if you don't like the book, just like buy it. Like if you don't like my writing, just look at it. It's so beautiful.
Awesome.
I want to wallpaper my house in her illustrations. And then sometime next year, there will be a sequel to Gentleman's Guide out.
I feel like I just got an early Christmas present. Oh my goodness. Okay.
So it's narrated by Felicity. And it is, I have not a lot I can actually say about it at this point.
That's fine.
But yeah, it's called The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy. It is about
I'm sorry.
gasp of inhalation of joy.
I'm like trying to suppress my nerdiness.
That was wonderful. But it's about Felicity, and she sort of teams up with two other women from very different places in Europe than her, and they have science and pirate adventures. And that's sort of the short pitch for the book.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a few fun questions real fast. What is the history of the title of your book? Like, what is the first idea you had, and how has it developed?
So the title for a long time was the big queer European road trip novel, which was not something you can put on a book cover, as charming as that is. The title was actually incredibly painless to get to. I read a research book called The Gentleman's Guide to His Tour Through Italy, which is from the 1700s and was a guidebook that tourists took. And I sent that to my editor when we first started talking about titles, and I was like, I really like the cadence of this title. Could we do like The Gentleman's Guide to His Grand Tour or something like that, or His Tour Through Europe? And she didn't think that was sort of something people would understand, or the Grand Tour is not sort of a familiar enough term that people would recognize it. And I have a good friend who was one of the first readers of the book and who has really been supportive of the book, and I sort of turned to her in, not despair yet, we were like 5 minutes in, so there wasn't any despair yet. But I was like, I need like the second half of this because I really like The Gentleman's Guide too. And she immediately was like, Vice and Virtue, and I was like, easy. Apparently it's also a Panic at the Disco album, Vice and Virtue.
I did not know that.
So I had all these, like, when it first got announced, all these like adorable emo 15-year-olds were like, is this a Panic at the Disco novel? And I was like, no, it's history.
How has history influenced your writing? Like, you've talked about history, and how would you say you incorporated that into your writing, and how would you say that it has become a part of it, and how did you
It's just like so much reading. You have to read everything possible, and then understand that as much as you read, you're not going to be prepared to write. And as much as you read, you're going to sit down to write, and 2 pages in, you're going to be like, crap, do they eat their dishes, or do they eat their dishes? Do they eat their food off like saucers or dishes, like all these things that you don't think about researching when you're looking at sort of a broad political, socioeconomic, cultural overview of a time period.
And especially since you have so many like anomalies from that time period.
Yeah, the minority experiences. Those were actually no, they're not easy to research. They're hard to find things about, but they're easy because you can narrow it down and be like, I know exactly what I need to find.
Yeah.
Whereas there's these sort of like, it's the little tiny details that always trip me up. The things like, how do you like fasten your pants? How'd you,
like, what do you wear the sleeve?
Yeah, like things like that. And so I generally end up doing a lot of broad research and then understanding that as I write, I'm just gonna have to be like constantly looking for more too.
So you have a character, the main character, Monty, he's bisexual, right? And you mention like queerness a lot throughout the book. What would your message be to young kids maybe reading this book looking for solace or part of the LGBT community? Like, what would your message to them be?
Basically, so I grew up in a really conservative community, and as a result, it didn't like occur to me that queer people had existed before like Rent until embarrassingly late in my like teenage and early 20s. And then when I was studying history and when I was working towards my history degree, I was so frustrated with the fact that all the generals in the mainstream history classes you took were all about straight white guys. And then if you want to take a women's history or queer history or history about anything other than Europe, you have to like take a special elective that only counts for a certain kind of credit, and it's like in a basement room with no windows and bad air conditioning, and it's terrible. And I was so frustrated by that, so I ended up doing like a lot of work on my own and finding these things on my own. And the more I read about queer history, the more I found a lot of comfort and solace in knowing that queer people have always existed, but not only have they always existed, but like they have always not been queer people have always been more than just like the tragic subplot in a BBC period drama.
Thank you.
People have always survived, but more than that, they have worked and thrived and found ways to have like full romantic and sexual lives with the people they love. And progress is not a linear thing. It's not that we've started with nothing and then worked our way up. It's sort of a spiral, and it always ebbs and flows. And so for me, what I most hope any teens, but especially queer teens, will take away from the book is knowing that like queer people have always existed, and they've always made it work, and we've always been here, and we've always found a way to live our lives happy and fulfilled, and you can make it work. It'll happen.
Yeah. That's a really good answer. Last question.
Yeah.
What would you have to say to aspiring young writers who are looking to maybe be where you are now? What would you have to say to them?
I would say take yourself seriously. Especially I hear so many people who say they're aspiring writers when really like as soon as you start writing, you are a writer, and own that. And especially when you're starting out, nobody's going to like vouch for you or advocate for you except you, and nobody's going to be precious with your writing time except you. So take yourself seriously, call yourself a writer, allow yourself to carve out time that you say, this is my writing time, and I'm going to take myself seriously, and I'm going to invest in myself as a writer, because no one else is going to do it but you when you're starting off. And even when you get further in, a lot of the time you're still your only advocate. So take yourself seriously, call yourself a writer, own your writing time. But then at the same time, I know it can be really scary to be like, I'm a writer, because when people are like, what do you do? I'm like, I watch a lot of Netflix, so
I drink
Diet Coke, so it can be tough. But be your own advocate. Be what's the word? Be fierce on behalf of your own writing, and also know there's no right way to do it. I think that's the other thing, is we have this sort of idea that there's one way to get published, there's one way to write a book, there's one way to form a sentence, don't use adverbs, like, what is it, Stephen King always says don't use adverbs, and that makes me so mad. Like, everyone's process is different, every book I write is written differently, so trust your own process, know that there aren't rules, find what works for you, and don't let people freak you out when they say like, this is how you write a book, or this is how you write, or this is what you should write, because there is no correct answer to any of that.
Thank you.
Is that an okay answer?
Yeah, that was an awesome answer. That's like the best answer I've gotten to that question. They're all usually like, keep on writing and don't stop.
The best answer.
I mean, we could get you a button.
Best answer.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. This was really awesome. Thank you.
Nice to talk to you.
Great.
Questions.